Here we are. It's a pleasant late autumn afternoon, but yes, it's very pleasant. We thought we'd change the scenery as you're getting sick and tired of trees that were standing up, so we found some trees were being cut down just to, highlight what's happening. But look, what I want to talk about today is the scourge of privatisation. Now, I don't think a lot of people understand where the concept of public services came from. I think it's just something that was handed down to us as a people. It's not, that's totally incorrect. The whole struggle, the revolutionary and radical struggles of the 19th century, especially in Europe, were based on the concept of transforming the state from an instrument of oppression and an instrument of exploitation and an instrument which was used by an exceptionally small minority, whether it was a hereditary minority or some type of dictatorship. The state began to look after the interests of the people. These were the very first part of that campaign. Obviously, as the state changed and there were more and more protests and revolts and revolutions, the state was transformed. It didn't lose its original function, that it held a monopoly on the use of force and exercised that monopoly through the law courts, the armed forces and the local police forces. But what happened? It was forced to take on an extra role. And that role was to look after the interests of the common people, the ordinary folk, the folk that didn't exercise power. That's what the state was forced to do through those protests, revolutions, revolts. This came to a head in Western Europe after the end of World War II, where over 50 million people died in the fight against fascism, whether it's fascism through the Nazi Third Reich, or fascism through the Japanese Imperial Forces, or fascism through the Italian Fascist Party. And great sacrifices had been made by people, and this heightened their ideas regarding the state's responsibility to them, and this led to a plethora of organisations being built by the state to look after the needs of the people. Things like a public health system with a universal access to it, irrespective of income. The expansion of the public education sector. The expansion of the financial sector, where you had in Australia banks like the Commonwealth Bank, which had been established in 1911 by one of the first Labor governments in the world. It was expanded to provide finances to small business and returned servicemen and women. The beginning and the expansion of a public housing sector across the country. When returned servicemen and women returned from fighting in the war, Second World War, they expected more than a tent on the grounds of the MCG, or the Botanic Gardens, the Royal Botanic Gardens in Melbourne, for their efforts. They expected access to housing. They expected access to education, especially post-secondary education. And then we had the expansion of the state in providing essential services. Because you see, not every service which is provided by the private sector can make a profit. And I'll speak about that in a few minutes' time. We saw the expansion into the essential services, gas, electricity, ports, and the list goes on and on. So what happened? This ensured that people had access to essential services irrespective of their financial position. That's the key. Things like the aged care sector, early childhood development, as well as primary sector and university education. It ensured that people had access to these essential services irrespective of their financial position, especially in terms of healthcare, with an increased sophistication in the types of treatment that are available and the cost of these treatments, and pharmaceuticals, a pharmaceutical benefit scheme. So we found in the 1970s that although things may not have been as sophisticated as they are today as far as technology is concerned, found that an average worker supporting a family could actually buy a home in 7 years. Today an average worker, two average workers supporting a family, can't even raise a deposit for a home in its 7 years. So what we saw is the extension of the public service. Now obviously there are limitations to the type of public service you have, and to a significant degree the type of service you receive depends on the skill of the public servants. And obviously in certain situations their skills may not be up to it, they may not have an interest in their job. And the idea came about in the 1980s that the public sector was second rate, that it couldn't do things as good as the private sector, that only the private sector could provide the best options. And then what people forgot was these options you're actually able to access through the private sector are directly related to your financial position. And if you've got no disposable income, you've got a major problem, because you can't access these services, or you can only access them in a limited way, or accessing services like health would bankrupt you and your family. This is the situation that people found themselves in, or didn't find themselves in. To be realistic, they thought, well, the private sector can provide it cheaper, faster, better, more reliable. And so the privatisation tsunami that has swept over this country in the last 40 years began. We saw the privatisation of essential services like the Commonwealth Bank in the 1980s, Telecom, which provided phone access in the 1980s. We saw the airports sold in the 1990s, the ports continuing to be sold up till this year. We saw the aged care sector become privatised. We saw the health sector begin to be run down. We saw early childhood development becoming privatised, and with the introduction of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, a wonderful scheme, we've seen how the private sector is now trying to get as much money out of it as possible and destroy that particular sector. So ultimately, what we saw is the outsourcing, that's right, the outsourcing of public responsibilities to the private sector. And nothing highlights this more than what's been happening to the public housing sector in Victoria, which through the affordable community, social and inclusive housing sector has been privatised by stealth. We've come to the situation where people don't even understand the difference between a public or a private sector until they are directly affected, until they find they need urgent accommodation, until they find they need health care, until they find they need access to pharmaceuticals, until they find their children need access to education, or you need access to affordable electricity or gas, and the list goes on and on. So the reality is very, very, very different when public services are privatised. And 40 years later, we are beginning to understand what has happened and what is happening with privatisation. Because as individuals, we are now being asked to bear the cost. Bear the cost in terms of escalating housing prices, where for $1 million, you may be lucky enough to find yourself, and I'm using the word lucky in inverted commas, lucky enough to find a 3-bedroom home 30 to 40 kilometres from the CBD of a major capital city. And this has occurred because there have been some very important consequences to the privatisation of essential public services, which go far beyond the problem of access if you don't have the necessary resources. Problems like the state destroying a source of revenue. Most publicly owned essential services created a profit for the state. This profit went to the Treasury. It's a little bit like selling your chickens, for a price and then finding out you've got no eggs. And that's what the state began to see. There was no access to profits which were made that went into the sector, that went into the public sector, that went into the Treasury, the public Treasury, at both a state and federal level. So this meant the burden of taxation was shifted to the individual by the goods and services tax, which may not have been necessary if we had strong public sector. The next important thing that people have forgotten is that in a capitalist society, in a mixed economy, that is one where you've got collectives and cooperatives, public institutions and public services, and privately provide service. So, look at the housing sector, for example. No public housing, no competition in the private residential marketplace. Prices increased 40-fold over a 30-year period, while wages increased 6-fold during that same period. If you had a strong public housing sector, what would happen is there'd be competition. Rents would drop, housing prices would drop at the lower end of the market, and more people would be able to access housing. Let's look at the banking sector, the financial sector. The privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank was a disaster. The Commonwealth Bank was publicly owned. That meant that Australia guaranteed people's deposit. The nation state guaranteed those deposits. When the Commonwealth Bank was privatised, that guarantee was removed. And currently we have a guarantee of $250,000 on deposits, which may seem a lot, but in reality is very small. Then we lost the stream of revenue that came from the Commonwealth Bank into the Treasury. But the most important role the Commonwealth Bank played was in terms of ensuring there was competition in the financial sector. That's right, competition in the financial sector. No competition, prices escalated, fees and charges escalated, costs to borrow escalated. Having a Commonwealth Bank would have ensured that those costs didn't escalate. Look at the aged care sector. The privatisation of the aged care sector is a total disaster. There are some services that need to be cross-subsidised by the taxpayer through the state. And now we've got the ludicrous situation where aged care sectors are paid so little, the Commonwealth Government, through the taxation system, is going to bankroll, that's you and me, a 15% rise to these workers. I agree completely with the 15% rise, but this didn't need to occur if the aged care sector hadn't been privatised. The same has occurred in the early childhood development sector. No competition. Community-run services have not been supported by successive governments. It's all been about privatisation. Look at the situation in the ports. The Port of Melbourne, which I'm familiar with, which was privatised by the Andrews-led Labor government in Victoria, a government which privatises everything that hasn't been locked down, including parcels of Crown land, including Melbourne Port, including the Road Traffic Authority, and even made moves to privatise Work Cover and Transport Action Commission, but this was put on hold because of union opposition. So that's the fact. The reality is privatisation is not fit for any society which wants to provide services to all its citizens irrespective of the financial situation they find themselves in. Privatisation is wonderful for people who have disposable income and who can insure themselves for the best healthcare available, who can send their kids to publicly subsidised private schools for a fee, who can in many ways access these resources. But it's disaster for everybody else. With winter around the corner, we have an increasing number of stories about people who can't keep themselves warm and the increased risk of disease. We have increased stories of private charities raising money to send Australian kids to public schools. Because privatisation, especially if it is supported by the taxpayer, as it is in private health insurance to a tune of over $6 billion, as it is in private education to a tune of over $10 billion, and the list goes on and on, as it is in terms of the fuel excise tax, and as a consequence of the minimal level of taxation which is paid by most corporations, we find that privatisation has been a total disaster, especially for the Australian people, especially for those people who don't have disposable income. And let's not forget, 30% of Australians don't even have enough savings to replace a broken down refrigerator with a new fridge. And that's the situation we face in Australia today. And as governments continue to privatise essential services, we will continue to suffer the consequences. Next time we set up publicly owned facilities, let's ensure their ownership is enshrined in the Australian Constitution. I know you're all thinking about the voice referendum, but another referendum which I think is exceptionally important is a referendum put to the Australian people. The creation of any new public assets ownership should be incorporated in the Australian Constitution. That means that any new public institutions which are created cannot be sold by the government of the day, to fill some black hole they have created through financial mismanagement. The rain is coming down. I think it's time we ended this. All the best. Next week it'll be back to the same old pleasantries.